This is the fourth video in the series, based in the main on chapters 2 and 3 of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. And this video will concentrate on the rhythm of the workers' struggle after the defeat of the 1905 revolution and up to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, and then looking at the effect of the war itself. So let's start with the rhythm of the struggle up to 1914. Now, after the defeat of the 1905 revolution, the combination of an industrial recession and the repression from the victorious counter-revolution drove the defeated movement back. By 1910, the number of strikes had fallen back to almost nothing. And it was in these years of reaction, where prejudice and skepticism again took hold of the discouraged masses, that the ideas of Menshevism took final shape, leading to the decisive break with the Bolsheviks in 1912. But Trotsky provides some figures which give a very good picture of that rhythm, based on the reports of political strikes from factory inspectors. So not covering everything, but nevertheless giving a good idea of the general trends. Have a look for yourself and see what you think. So clearly the figures show that ebb following the defeat of 1905, and then the years where counter-revolution absolutely took hold between 1908 and 1912. But the rhythm was affected by an industrial boom that began in 1910, and that gave the workers new confidence that they could risk taking action. So a wave of political strikes against the government began to break out, certainly from 1912 onwards, and by the beginning of 1914, over 1 million workers were taking action, according to the records. That's almost 50% of the entire recorded workforce. So the other point is that the new upswing wasn't simply a repeat of the past movement, but it reopened on a higher level, enriched by past experience, and Bolshevism began to rise swiftly on this new revolutionary tide. The secret police department reports, quoted by Trotsky, warned that the most energetic and audacious element, ready for tireless struggle, for resistance and continual organisation, is that element, those organisations and those people who are concentrated around Lenin. So the secret police knew that it was the Bolsheviks that were leading this struggle underground, and they were well informed about the Bolshevik organisation. Trotsky says that thanks to Secret Service infiltrators, they'd managed, for example, to nearly get a majority on the Petrograd Bolshevik Committee by 1914, with 3 out of the 7 places. Now, in the villages, the agrarian struggle followed a similar pattern of downturn and then revival, although it had been diverted into the struggle between the rich and poor peasants in the new cooperatives. But it reached ever higher levels of armed conflict over the division of communal land. And the big landlords didn't totally escape the peasants' anger, because land seizures and the burning of harvests and haystacks also became more frequent. By 1914, a revolutionary situation was clearly approaching. But the strike figures also show that once the World War started, that cut right across developments. It knocked the movement far backwards, only to then let it accelerate later when the war wore on. But the immediate effect on the workers' movement was devastating. Severe penalties were imposed for striking, the workers' press was closed down, trade unions and political organisations brutally repressed. The Bolsheviks, alone amongst the socialist parties, began after initial hesitation to try and spread anti-war agitation, but they faced enormous difficulties. In November 1914, the 5 Bolshevik deputies to the Duma, their rather toothless parliament, were arrested, including Kamenev, and sent into exile in Siberia. But those sentences provoked hardly a murmur of protest amongst the workers. They were disorientated by the war and the appeals for yet more patriotic production in the factories. Not to mention the retreat of nearly all the leaders of the European socialist parties into the camps of their respective national governments in support of the slaughter. Now, the collapse of the Second International at the outbreak of the First World War is of such significance, it's worth taking just a quick diversion to look into that. Now, there are various books that you can read. Trotsky's My Life is very readable autobiography as one. Also, Trotsky's readings on World War I, particularly, you can find it online. War in the International is worth looking at. But, Trotsky in My Life makes the point that it was absolutely shocking to the international Marxist movement that indeed, Trotsky makes the point in My Life that when the issue of Vorwärts, the German SPD paper, arrived in Switzerland in early August with the report of the meeting of the Reichstag, where the SPD, supposedly socialist deputies, had ended up voting for the war budget of the Kaiser, Lenin decided it was a fate number published by the German General Staff to deceive and frighten their enemies. Now, Trotsky makes the point that actually he'd already experienced the conservative side of social democracy in Austria and Germany, so it didn't come as a surprise to him at all. But what then would be the position that internationalists, genuine Marxists, should take? How would the outbreak of the war affect the revolutionary movement? Again, there's some useful points within Trotsky's My Life. He makes the point that while revolution directs its blows against the established power, war, at first, strengthens that state power. It appears to be the only firm support and everyone gets behind it. But then he crucially makes the point, then war undermines that power. So hopes of strong movements are, as Trotsky says, utterly groundless at the outset of a war. But, and this is the crucial point, he says this is only a political delay, a sort of political moratorium. The notes have been extended to a new date, but they will have to be paid. So Trotsky understood that revolutionaries would have to bide their time. But at some point, the movement would start to revive. And that was the point that genuine Marxists, those that hadn't abandoned the position of internationalism, were going to have to wait and prepare for. But those genuine internationalists were very small in number. Trotsky again describes his journey to Switzerland for the so-called Zimmerwald Conference in 1915, where a handful of delegates gathered together who were opposed to the war. Many of them were just general pacifists rather than revolutionaries. But Trotsky makes the point that the delegates themselves joked about the fact that half a century after the founding of the First International, it was still possible to seat all the internationalists at the conference in 4 stagecoaches. So they were very small in number. And indeed, the pacifist wing, although it agreed to the manifesto, really didn't take the revolutionary position that was being put forward by Lenin. Again, Trotsky makes the point, in many questions, he was in a minority of 1. Yet Lenin was tightening up the spring of the future international action. In a Swiss mountain village, he was laying the cornerstone of the Revolutionary International. So let's develop those general points which Trotsky is setting out in his autobiography, My Life, and see the specific points that he raises in his History of the Russian Revolution about the effect of the war on the Russian movement. Now, he makes the point that the most revolutionary workers had soon been sent to fight at the front, and their places had been taken by politically more backward elements straight from the villages. So in Petrograd, there was about a 40% change in the workforce. The Bolsheviks, therefore, were left without any central organisation, its leaders under arrest or in exile, and some of its best fighters no longer in the city. But the discontent nevertheless surfaced, as Trotsky predicted. He makes out to start with it was in kind of contradictory ways. For example, criticisms not of the war itself, but that it was being run badly. And in 1915, while the factory workers were still holding back, fearing after all being sent to the trenches, it was the less organised sections, such as the women, who first felt bold enough to protest. Food disorders, sometimes riots over food shortages, broke out, spreading right across the country. And those early battles broke through the lull and led the way to the first strikes. Prices, after all, had risen far beyond wages, and those early strikes, particularly, say, June 1915, centred on the textile workers as economic strikes. And the protests were stormy after the preceding lull, and there were meetings and battles with the police and army in which several workers died. It was very raw compared to that of 1912 to 1914. Not surprising, given the weakness of the workers' organisations and the involvement of these new raw layers. The Tsar's ministers simply responded with even greater repression. Now, the big bourgeois, on the other hand, attempted to split the movement. They set up these things called military industrial committees, where they involved workers' representatives on the boards running the factories. Something, of course, we've seen as a tactic much later in history. And using these leaders, who were often Mensheviks, the bosses hoped to impose a kind of regime of industrial patriotism to hold back the working class. But despite that, at the shop floor, if you like, the weakened Bolshevik organisation began to revive through the impetus of the strike movement. And their slogans against the war and the government and for a republic were getting a more sympathetic response. And the strike wave deepened. On the traditional protest day of January the 9th, the 11th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday massacre in 1916, a widespread strike took place, whereas almost nothing had happened the year before. And in these demonstrations, troops and workers were now more often making friendly contact. Meanwhile, in the villages, the war had caused chaos as well. About 10 million rural workers and about 2 million of their horses had been taken to the front. The weaker homesteads already began to find it impossible to survive. And by 1916, the middle layer of peasants were going under as well. And so, not surprisingly, the mood of opposition grew. Perhaps rarely taking the form of open protest like in the cities. After all, most of the young active forces in the villages had been sent to the front. Nevertheless, the soldiers did not forget the injustice of life in the villages as they crouched themselves in the trenches. And let's look at what life was like there. As a further example of the combined development in Russia, it had all the latest weapons of war at its disposal, secured from its allies, but it had neither capacity to reproduce them in its factories nor transport them to the front with sufficient speed. And the Russian armies proved totally incapable of competing with the strong German war machine. Its only limited successes came against the even more decrepit regime of Austria-Hungary. And actually it was out of these battles that some of the more confident generals that later came forward to be the leaders of the White Armies against the Soviet forces in the civil war that followed the October Revolution. Universal military service simply reproduced the contradictions and crises of Russia as a whole into the army. The useless commanders mirrored the rotten ruling class, while the peasant soldiers' lack of technical experience meant that they couldn't master modern military technique. Of the first 15 million men mobilised in the first year or so of the war, 5.5 million were killed, wounded or captured. In all, 2.5 million were killed in the war, and that's 40% of the total losses of the so-called Allies. And Trotsky describes how the lower ranks measured the confusion of the generals by the number of purposeless manoeuvres on soulless shoes, the number of dinners not eaten. From the bloody mash of people emerged a generalised word, the mess, although in soldiers' jargon that was replaced by a still juicier term. Everything for the war, said the ministers, the deputies, the generals, the journalists. Yes, the soldier began to think in the trenches. They're all ready to fight to the last drop of blood. But my blood. Soon the peasant army began to disintegrate. Despite floggings and other brutal punishments, desertions grew. And of course, the sick and deserted brought their longing for peace back to the cities and villages. And in the army, the revolutionary elements finally began to get a hearing. But the economic mess grew worse. The Tsarist state demanded more and more of its national wealth to pay for the war effort. The war industries grew up enormously, drowning out the peacetime branches of production. But of course, enormous fortunes were also being made. The lack of fuel and bread in the capital didn't prevent the court jeweller Fabergé from doing record business. Nothing came of the efforts to plan production, since the Tsarist bureaucracy and the bourgeois military-industrial committees were fighting each other for control of industry. Much of the skilled workforce had been sent to the front, the mines and factories of Poland had been lost, the overloaded transport system threatened to grind to a halt. And the so-called liberal bourgeoisie, just as Trotsky and Lenin and others had predicted, far from being a friend of the poor soldiers, were quite happy getting rich from the slaughter. They even tried to use the military defeats to try and help tighten their grip on economic power at the expense of the nobility, and they began to throw out accusations of the Tsar being linked by family ties to the German enemy. Now the workers began to move from the economic plane to the political plane. The idea grew that if only we all strike at once, we can finish the whole thing. And the number of political strikes started to rocket. But that wasn't the only thing that was rocketing. By the end of 1916, inflation was rocketing too, now combined with an actual lack of goods to be bought. And there was a wave of meetings and demonstrations through the factories, uniting all of the masses' grievances, food supplies, the high cost of living, war, government, all into one struggle. And by the first months of 1917, political strikes now involved 6 times as many workers as economic strikes. Petrograd, as usual, took the leading role. The tide of opposition was growing ever higher. Bolshevik leaflets were being distributed, the general strike slogan gaining support. And Trotsky notes in his history that reaction were getting worried. The director of police noted in Trotsky's history, it's quoted, that in comparison to 1905, the mood of opposition has gone very far, far beyond anything to be seen in the broad masses during the above-mentioned period of disturbances. In other words, compared to 1905, the movement had returned on a higher plane. And again, they were also worried about the Bolsheviks. And one group of police officials warned the Tsar that the revolutionary parties could now count on the sympathy of the overwhelming majority of the peasantry. And they will follow the proletariat the very moment these revolutionary leaders point a finger to other people's land. And with some justification, perhaps not about the money, they noted that the danger and strength of these parties lies in the fact that they have an idea, they have money, they have a crowd ready and well organised. Now, the provinces followed the same stages as Petrograd, if a little bit more slowly. But by 1917, as the strike movement swung decisively from the economic to political plane, the role of the capital and the most advanced layers like the metal workers became increasingly important. The Bloody Sunday anniversary on January the 9th, 1917, was met by a strike of 150,000 in Petrograd alone. As Trotsky figures show, over 500,000 workers were reported as being involved in political strikes in just the first 2 months of 1917, most of them being in Petrograd. In every factory, a nucleus of activists was forming, usually around the Bolsheviks, and the workers felt that retreat now was impossible. The February Revolution was at hand.